The King's Agony. At 76, King Charles made a shocking confession that proved a dark royal truth. The crown is paid for with a broken heart. His agonizing words weren't about Camilla or even Diana. They were about a secret love the palace buried, and a devastating choice that has haunted him his entire life. At 76, after a lifetime spent waiting in the wings, King Charles III finally ascended the throne. But with the crown came a crushing weight, and in a moment of shocking candor, he did something utterly unthinkable for a monarch. He tore down the gilded curtain of royal protocol and exposed a raw, bleeding wound that had festered for over half a century. In a voice heavy with the ghosts of wasted years, he spoke of a great love, a true love, sparking a global firestorm of speculation. The world leaned in, captivated, as the newly minted king spoke not of his duties, but of his regrets. The immediate assumption was that he was speaking of Camilla, the woman who played the long, silent game, waiting patiently in the shadows for decades to finally become his queen. Her loyalty was undeniable, a constant presence through scandal and public condemnation. An acknowledgement of her steadfastness seemed a fitting, if overdue, tribute. But then, a darker, more tragic possibility emerged. Was he confessing a final, profound regret over Diana, the sainted people's princess he could never bring himself to fully love? The mother of his heirs, whose global adoration he resented, and whose tragic death left a permanent stain on his legacy. The thought was chilling. But the king's words hinted at something far more devastating. A secret buried so deep that only a handful of palace insiders even knew it existed. His melancholy tone, his references to wasted chances and a future that never was, suggested the biggest bombshell of all, that his true soulmate was a woman whose name history has never been allowed to speak. A ghost from his youth, sacrificed on the cold altar of royal duty. This wasn't a tribute, it was the agonizing cry of a man who had everything and nothing. It was the opening of a wound that had never truly healed, revealing the dark, unspoken truth of the monarchy. For a king, duty is a gilded prison, and the price of the throne is the soul itself. His confession left the world with a haunting question. Who was she? At 76, after a lifetime spent waiting in the wings, King Charles III finally ascended the throne. But with the crown came a crushing weight, and in a moment of shocking candor, he did something utterly unthinkable for a monarch. He tore down the gilded curtain of royal protocol and exposed a raw, bleeding wound that had festered for over half a century. In a voice heavy with the ghosts of wasted years, he spoke of a great love, a true love, sparking a global firestorm of speculation. The world leaned in, captivated, as the newly minted king spoke not of his duties, but of his regrets. The immediate assumption was that he was speaking of Camilla, the woman who played the long, silent game, waiting patiently in the shadows for decades to finally become his queen. Her loyalty was undeniable, a constant presence through scandal and public condemnation. An acknowledgement of her steadfastness seemed a fitting, if overdue, tribute. But then a darker, more tragic possibility emerged. Was he confessing a final profound regret over Diana, the sainted people's princess he could never bring himself to fully love? The mother of his heirs, whose global adoration he resented, and whose tragic death left a permanent stain on his legacy. The thought was chilling. But the king's words hinted at something far more devastating. A secret buried so deep that only a handful of palace insiders even knew it existed. His melancholy tone, his references to wasted chances and a future that never was, suggested the biggest bombshell of all, that his true soulmate was a woman whose name history has never been allowed to speak. A ghost from his youth, sacrificed on the cold altar of royal duty. This wasn't a tribute. It was the agonizing cry of a man who had everything and nothing. It was the opening of a wound that had never truly healed, revealing the dark, unspoken truth of the monarchy. For a king, duty is a gilded prison, and the price of the throne is the soul itself. His confession left the world with a haunting question. Who was she? Before he was the conflicted monarch whose confession shook the world, Charles was a sensitive, solitary boy, trapped in a world that demanded a stoic automaton. His life was not one of fairy tale privilege, but a brutal forging in the fires of royal expectation. While other boys climbed trees and scraped their knees, Charles was a living exhibit, his every move scrutinized, his every word rehearsed. He was raised not by loving parents, but by a series of nannies and the cold, unyielding demands of the institution he was born to inherit. The firm, that relentless machine of monarchy, required an heir without feelings, a symbol without a soul. The crucible for this cruel transformation was the notoriously harsh Gordonstoun School in Scotland. It was the same Spartan institution his own father, the tough-as-nails Prince Philip, had attended and thrived in. Philip was convinced that the school's regimen of freezing cross-country runs, icy showers, and rugged discipline would make a man of his gentle son. It did the opposite. For Charles, Gordonstoun was a waking nightmare. A shy, artistic boy, he was relentlessly bullied for his ears, his title, and his very nature. He was a lonely, miserable figure wandering the windswept Scottish grounds, writing desperate letters home that went largely ignored. He later described his time there with a chilling accuracy. He called it Colditz in kilts. This childhood was profoundly dysfunctional, but it only set the stage for a life and career that would be beset by emotional catastrophe. The years at Gordonstoun hammered into him a dangerous lesson. To survive, one must hide one's heart. He learned to bury his feelings beneath a placid, impenetrable mask of duty. Every public smile was calculated, every handshake a performance. He was being hollowed out, transformed from a person into a prince, from a man into a future monarch. He was no longer Charles, he was the Prince of Wales, a living symbol of tradition and continuity, whose personal feelings were an inconvenient and dangerous liability. Little did he know, this brutal training in the art of emotional repression was not building character, it was creating a tragic flaw. It was the first, fateful step on a dark path that would lead to devastating consequences for everyone he would ever claim to love. The boy who was taught never to show his pain would grow into a man incapable of understanding the pain of others, setting the stage for one of the most infamous and heartbreaking royal tragedies in history. His fate was sealed not on the throne, but in the cold dormitories of a school that broke his spirit. Before Diana, the tragic princess, and even before Camilla, the Shadow Queen, there was a ghost. A secret love that the monarchy has spent decades trying to erase from history. In the fleeting, sunlit freedom of his youth, before the full weight of the crown had crushed his spirit, Prince Charles encountered a woman who saw through the suffocating royal facade. She saw not the future king, but simply the man, shy, thoughtful, and yearning for a genuine connection. She was intelligent, vibrant, and fiercely independent, everything the firm, with its cold and calculating priorities, despised. She was, in their eyes, utterly and dangerously unsuitable. For a brief, dazzling moment, Charles experienced a life he might have lived. In her company, he could laugh without rehearsing, speak without being coached. She addressed him as Charles, not Your Royal Highness. It was an intoxicating taste of normalcy, a glimpse into a world where his heart, not his title, could choose his path. He was in love, perhaps for the only truly pure time in his life. But that love was a direct threat to the established order. It was a romance that could not and would not be tolerated. The crown, that insatiable beast, demanded its sacrifice. The men in grey suits, the shadowy courtiers who truly run the palace, saw her not as a woman, but as a liability. The royal family closed ranks. The pressure mounted, a silent, suffocating campaign to force him back in line. And Charles, the boy who had been taught to obey, to repress, to put duty before all else, was simply not strong enough to fight for her. He was forced to make a fateful and horrific decision. He surrendered the one person who made him feel whole. That choice would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was not just a youthful heartbreak. It was a profound act of self-betrayal that carved out a permanent void in his soul. This secret sorrow became a poison that seeped into everything that followed. It poisoned his future marriage, casting a long, dark shadow from which Diana could never escape, making her feel like a runner-up from the moment she said, "I do." The ghost of this lost love lingered in the corridors of the palace, a constant, silent reminder of the happiness he had been forced to abandon. He placed duty above his heart, and in doing so, condemned himself and those around him to a lifetime of regret. It was the original sin from which all other tragedies would grow. With the ghost of his true love banished and his heart safely locked away, the royal machine cranked into motion for its next grim task, securing the bloodline. This wasn't about finding a partner for the prince. It was a cold, clinical search for a suitable womb to carry the next heir to the throne. The firm needed a bride, and their checklist was brutally pragmatic. She had to be an aristocrat, she had to be Protestant, and most critically in their archaic view, she had to be a virgin. The search, methodical and unsentimental, led them to Lady Diana Spencer, a shy, 19-year-old girl working as a kindergarten aide. On paper, she was perfect. The daughter of an earl, she hailed from one of Britain's most ancient and storied families. She was beautiful in a fresh, unassuming way, and her past was untainted by scandal. But most importantly to the palace puppeteers, she seemed pliable. Traumatized by her parents' bitter divorce and her mother abandoning the family, she appeared quiet, naive, and eager to please a blank slate upon which the monarchy could write its glorious future. She was not chosen for love. She was selected for her pedigree and her perceived innocence, a lamb groomed for a royal sacrifice. The public, starved for a feel-good story, immediately fell in love with Shy Di. They saw a fairy tale romance beginning to blossom, a handsome prince choosing a commoner at heart to be his future queen. The press whipped up a frenzy of excitement, but behind the opulent walls of Buckingham Palace, a much darker story was unfolding. Charles, still mourning the love he had been forced to abandon, was ambivalent and distant. He barely knew this young woman, having met her only a handful of times. Yet, pressured by his father and the relentless ticking of the royal clock, he proposed. Diana, swept up in a whirlwind she couldn't possibly comprehend, accepted. But she was not walking into a fairy tale. She was stepping into a gilded cage, a sacrificial lamb being led to a globally televised altar. Little did she know, her life was about to take an unbelievably dark turn. She was about to step into a role that would make her the most famous and adored woman on the planet, while simultaneously and systematically destroying her from the inside out. The nightmare was just beginning. On the 29th of July 1981, the world stopped to watch a fairy tale unfold. An estimated global audience of 750 million people tuned in for what was billed as the wedding of the century. Millions packed the streets of London, waving Union Jacks and cheering as a radiant Lady Diana Spencer, draped in an iconic gown with a 25-foot train, glided down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral to marry her prince. It was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, a much-needed dose of escapism and romance for a nation mired in recession. But the worst was yet to come. Behind the beaming smiles, the waving crowds, and the kiss on the Buckingham Palace balcony, a chilling horror was taking place. This was not a fairy tale. It was a carefully stage-managed lie. Just days before the wedding, Diana made a devastating discovery. While in the office of one of Charles's aides, she stumbled upon a package. Inside was a gold bracelet, engraved with the letters G and F. They were the initials for Gladys and Fred, the private, intimate nicknames Charles and his true love, Camilla Parker Bowles, used for each other. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her future husband was giving a parting gift to his mistress on the eve of their wedding. She was utterly devastated. Heartbroken and filled with a nauseating dread, she confronted Charles, who callously dismissed her concerns. She reportedly told her sisters she couldn't go through with it, that she couldn't marry him. But it was too late. The wedding was a global television event, a massive state occasion with immense political and cultural significance. The die had been cast. The show had to go on. And so, the young Diana, just 20 years old, was forced to bury her anguish and play her part. She walked towards her future down that cathedral aisle knowing, with absolute certainty, that her husband's heart belonged to another woman. The opulent curtains of Buckingham Palace obscured a terrible secret. As she said her vows, her eyes scanned the congregation, searching for the face of her rival, Camilla. This wasn't the start of a love story. It was the public consecration of a devastating, soul-crushing lie, and for Diana, the beginning of an utter nightmare from which she would never truly awaken. Camilla Parker Bowles was never just a friend. To understand the catastrophic implosion of Charles and Diana's marriage, one must understand that she was his anchor, his confidant, the one person with whom he could shed the suffocating skin of royalty and simply be himself. They met at a polo match in the early 1970s, and their connection was instant and profound. She was witty, confident, and refreshingly down-to-earth. Famously, she is said to have broken the ice by saying, "My great-grandmother was the mistress of your great-great-grandfather. I feel we have something in common." Charles was immediately smitten. He loved her bawdy sense of humor, her earthiness, and her deep, intuitive understanding of the gilded prison he lived in. With her, there was no pretense. But she was not deemed suitable. In the rigid, unforgiving calculus of the monarchy, she had two fatal flaws. She was not a virgin, and she was perceived as having too much of a past to fit the pristine, fairy tale image the crown demanded for its future queen. So, despite their clear devotion, the path was blocked. Charles was sent overseas on naval duty, and in his absence, a heartbroken Camilla married the dashing army officer Andrew Parker Bowles. But that was not the end of their story. It was merely the beginning of its most destructive chapter. While Charles was pushed towards the young, innocent Diana, his bond with Camilla never severed. It couldn't. It simply went underground, transforming into a clandestine, torrid affair that festered at the very heart of his marriage. She was the third person in the union from the very beginning, a constant, looming presence that made Diana feel like a perpetual outsider in her own life. Charles confided in Camilla, sought her advice, and shared a level of intimacy with her that he never offered his own wife. This wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was a profound emotional one. Diana was left utterly heartbroken and full of envious rage, forced to contend with the shadow of a woman her husband clearly preferred. Their affair became the family's dirty little secret, a devastating deception that would eventually erupt into one of the greatest and most damaging royal scandals in modern history, shaking the monarchy to its core and setting the stage for an unspeakable tragedy. The firm had expected Diana to be a quiet, elegant, and above all, manageable accessory to the future king. They were catastrophically wrong. Almost overnight, the shy girl they had selected for her perceived meekness transformed into a global superstar, a phenomenon of charisma, beauty, and compassion the world had never seen. During their first royal tour of Australia, the carefully laid plans for a Charles-centric trip were completely upended. Crowds didn't just admire Diana, they adored her. They screamed her name, jostled for position, and were desperate for a single touch from their new fairy tale princess. And Charles, the man born and raised to be the center of the universe, was utterly and humiliatingly eclipsed. He was forced to walk in her long shadow, becoming a bitter afterthought in the public's adoring eye. At one point, he grimly joked to the press, "I've come to the conclusion that it would be far easier to have two wives to cover both sides of the street. I could have just walked down the middle, directing the operation." But behind the strained humor was a palpable and poisonous jealousy. He simply could not handle being the second act. This crushing disappointment quickly curdled into a cruel and corrosive resentment that he unleashed on Diana behind closed doors. He began to mock her, belittling her intelligence, and dismissing her global fame as a frivolous fluke based on her looks and youth. What he perceived as her emotional nature, a quality the public loved, he saw as a sign of weakness and instability. He hated that they preferred her over him, and he made sure she knew it. He had expected an obedient wife who would bolster his own image. Instead, he got a megastar who made him irrelevant. The consequences were disastrous. The fragile foundations of their marriage began to crack under the immense pressure of her stardom and his envy, setting the stage for a private war that would become brutally public. Behind the flawless facade of the people's princess, a woman was trapped in a private hell. While the world saw dazzling gowns and a radiant smile, the reality inside the cold, unfeeling walls of Kensington Palace was an utter nightmare. Isolated from her friends, monitored by courtiers, and married to a man who was emotionally absent and in love with another woman, Diana spiraled into a devastating cycle of despair. Charles's emotional aloofness, coupled with his ever-present connection to Camilla, left her feeling utterly worthless and profoundly, crushingly alone. This intense emotional torment soon manifested in a secret, brutal physical battle. Diana developed bulimia nervosa, a dangerous eating disorder. It began the week after her engagement, triggered by a thoughtless comment from Charles, who put his hand on her waist and said, "Oh, a bit chubby here, aren't we?" That cruel remark, combined with the stress and her feelings of inadequacy, lit a devastating fuse. The cycle of binging and purging became a desperate coping mechanism. It was, as she later admitted, the one and only thing in her life that she felt she could control, a life where every other aspect was dictated by others. It was a secret she kept for years, a physical manifestation of the poison coursing through her marriage. She documented the horror of her existence in secretly recorded tapes and diary entries, chronicling a solitude so deep it was soul-crushing. She spoke of being constantly surrounded by people, yet feeling an isolation that was almost unbearable. She felt invisible, unheard, and unloved. Her desperate cries for help, both verbal and nonverbal, were callously ignored by the royal household. Her mood swings and tears were dismissed as the histrionics of a young, unstable, and difficult girl who simply wasn't coping with the pressures of her new role. The firm had no mechanism for dealing with genuine human suffering. It only demanded that the flawless public image be maintained at all costs. Her horrific fate was being sealed, one lonely, tear-filled night at a time. She was disintegrating internally, and no one in a position of power seemed to care. For years, Diana suffered in silence. She played the part of the perfect royal wife, producing 2 healthy sons and dazzling the world with her beauty and grace, all while her heart was breaking behind the palace walls. But there comes a point where even a princess decides she has had enough. The breaking point, the go-to-hell moment, was not a single confrontation, but a slow-burning, agonizing awakening. It was the dawning, horrific realization that the system the firm she had married into was never going to protect her. In fact, it was actively hostile to her very existence. In her private writings and the secret tapes she made with author Andrew Morton, she documented the relentless and soul-destroying emotional neglect. She chronicled the cruel way Charles would consistently dismiss her feelings as trivial, making her feel irrational, needy, and insane, a classic tactic of gaslighting. When she would confront him about his affair, he would shut down, leaving her to sob alone. She wrote, "With devastating simplicity, I feel as though I am suffering internally, and he remains unaware." This chronic invalidation, this constant erasure of her pain, finally ignited her fury. She realized she was an individual, not simply his wife or a broodmare for the dynasty. She was a woman with thoughts, feelings, and a voice of her own. And if the crown and its cold-hearted courtiers would not allow her to use that voice within the palace, she resolved that she would find a way to shout her truth to the entire world. She began to subtly defy them, collaborating in secret on a tell-all book that would expose the lie of the fairy tale marriage. She was no longer the shy, pliable girl they had chosen. The silent lamb was finding her roar. A rebellion was brewing, and she had made a powerful, defiant vow. "They will not defeat me. I possess greater strength than they perceive." Sadly, it was the beginning of the end. Any lingering, naive hope that the royal marriage could somehow be salvaged was obliterated by a single, squalid revelation. In 1993, the press got their hands on a secretly recorded 1,989 telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, and its contents were so jaw-dropping they sent shockwaves across the globe. The scandal was immediately dubbed Camillagate, and it was a moment of pure, unadulterated humiliation for the royal family. The transcript laid bare the startlingly intimate and frankly bizarre details of their ongoing affair. The call was filled with declarations of love and longing. Charles told Camilla he wanted to live inside her trousers. This led to the now infamous exchange where he joked that, with his luck, he'd be reincarnated as her tampon. The press had a field day. The future King of England, the defender of the faith, was exposed not as a dignified statesman, but as a lovesick adulterer, fantasizing about becoming a feminine hygiene product. The sordid details were splashed across every tabloid, a moment of utter, cringe-inducing shock that shattered the carefully crafted image of the stoic heir. For Diana, it was the final, devastating proof of the betrayal she had endured in private for years. Now, the entire world knew the filthy truth. She later described the leak as sick, a cruel and public confirmation of her deepest fears and insecurities. It was one thing to know her husband was unfaithful. It was another to have the explicit details of his affair become a national punchline. The Camillagate tape wasn't just a scandal. It was a nuclear bombshell that laid bare the sordid reality behind the palace gates. It proved Diana's darkest suspicions had been true all along and made a mockery of the monarchy, turning a private tragedy into a humiliating public farce from which there was no return. Cornered, isolated, and with the palace machinery turning against her, Diana did the unthinkable. She decided to burn the whole house down. In a move of breathtaking audacity, she secretly arranged a television interview with the BBC's flagship program, Panorama, in 1995. Without the Queen's knowledge or permission, she sat down in her Kensington Palace apartment and calmly detonated a bomb at the very heart of the British monarchy. For nearly an hour, with 23 million people in the UK alone watching, transfixed, she told her side of the story. With a haunting, quiet candor, she spoke of her postnatal depression, her struggles with bulimia, and her attempts at self-harm. She painted a devastating picture of an emotionally cold and unsupportive royal family that offered no help, only judgment. She admitted to her own affair with James Hewitt, but framed it as a desperate search for the affection she never received from her husband. And then came the line that would echo through history. The final, fatal blow to the fairy tale. When asked if Camilla Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of her marriage, Diana looked directly into the camera and said, with devastating understatement, "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." It was a direct, devastating strike against Charles and his mistress, a confirmation of the affair that the palace had tried for years to deny. The interview was an act of magnificent rebellion. For years, she had been cast as the unstable, hysterical victim. But with this one, masterful television appearance, she seized complete control of her own narrative. She exposed the lie of the fairy tale for good, revealing the cold, cruel reality of her life behind the castle walls. It was a moment of shocking, unprecedented honesty that shook the British monarchy to its very foundations and turned public opinion irrevocably in her favor. She had found her voice, and the world was finally listening. Diana's Panorama interview was not just a confession, it was a declaration of war, and the monarchy's response was swift, silent, and absolutely ruthless. Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who prized duty and discretion above all else, was reportedly incandescent with rage. Diana had broken the firm's cardinal rule: never complain, never explain. More than that, she had aired the family's dirty laundry on national television, threatening the very stability of the institution the Queen had sworn to protect. There would be no reconciliation, there would be no more pretense. Within weeks of the broadcast, a cold, final decree was issued from Buckingham Palace. The Queen sent a handwritten letter to both the Prince and Princess of Wales, advising them that an early divorce is desirable. It wasn't advice, it was a command. The royal project had failed in the most spectacular and public way imaginable, and it was time for a clinical amputation. The charade was over. The subsequent divorce, finalized in August 1996, was a bitter and public affair. The palace machine, now fully engaged against her, moved to strip Diana of her most coveted link to the family, her title. At Charles's insistence, she was to be known as Diana, Princess of Wales, but she would no longer be Her Royal Highness. It was a calculated, final act of exclusion, a petty and vindictive move meant to diminish her status and push her to the periphery. It was a message: you are no longer one of us. But in a cruel, delicious twist of fate for the royals, casting her out only made her more powerful. Freed from the suffocating constraints and archaic protocols of the palace, she was unbound, no longer just a princess trapped in a loveless marriage. She was reborn as a global icon of freedom, compassion, and resilience. She was the queen of people's hearts, and her influence was about to reach its zenith, a fact that would terrify her former in-laws. In the single year following her divorce, Diana truly came into her own. No longer bound by suffocating royal protocol or the judgment of her estranged husband, she blossomed into the woman she was always meant to be. She shed the image of a wronged wife and emerged as a humanitarian powerhouse. In a move that stunned the world, she strode through active landmine fields in Angola, bringing global attention to a horrific, forgotten conflict. She embraced AIDS patients at a time when they were still treated as untouchable pariahs, her simple acts of compassion shattering stigmas. She was more beloved, more influential, and more famous than ever before. The palace had tried to sideline her, and instead, she had become a global force for good, a queen in all but name. For a brief, sunlit moment, it seemed this fallen princess might finally get a happy ending. She found a new, whirlwind romance with the wealthy film producer Dodi Fayed. They were photographed cruising the Mediterranean on his yacht, a picture of carefree happiness. She was laughing again, finally free from the misery that had defined her adult life. But the corrupting nature of fame, the very force that had propelled her to global icon status, was also a relentless, deadly curse. She was the most hunted woman on the planet. A ravenous paparazzi pack stalked her every move, their camera lenses like the sights of sniper rifles. Every photo of her was worth a fortune, and the hunt for the money shot grew increasingly aggressive and dangerous. They saw her not as a person, a mother, a woman who had finally found a sliver of peace, but as a prize, a commodity to be captured and sold to the highest bidder. Sadly, it was the beginning of the end. The freedom she had fought so hard for had only tightened the net around her. Her nightmare was just beginning. On the 31st of August 1997, the relentless, insatiable hunt for Diana reached its devastating and inevitable conclusion. After a late dinner at the Ritz Hotel in Paris with Dodi Fayed, the couple made a desperate attempt to evade the swarm of paparazzi camped outside. They slipped out a back exit and into a black Mercedes S280, driven by the hotel's deputy head of security, Henri Paul. Pursued aggressively by photographers on motorcycles, their car sped into the dark Pont de l'Alma tunnel along the River Seine at an estimated 65 miles per hour. What happened next was a blur of screeching tires and a horrifying cacophony of shattering metal. The driver lost control, slamming into the tunnel's 13th concrete pillar. The crash was brutal, a catastrophic impact that killed Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul instantly. Diana, grievously injured and trapped in the mangled wreckage, was somehow still alive. But what they put her through next was downright cruel. As she lay dying, her body broken, the very photographers who had been chasing her descended on the gruesome scene. But they did not come to help. They came to capture the final, grisly images of the fallen princess. Their camera flashes illuminated the horrific carnage, a grotesque and inhuman feeding frenzy over the last moments of a woman's life. One of the last things Diana reportedly murmured was, "My God, what has happened?" She was rushed to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons fought for hours to save her, but her internal injuries were too severe. In the early hours of the morning, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. When her end came, it was quick, violent, and utterly horrific, a tragic and senseless demise brought about by the very celebrity that had both defined and destroyed her. The news of Diana's death sent a tidal wave of raw, unprocessed grief across the globe. It was a singular moment in history, an outpouring of emotion that no one could have predicted. In London, a literal sea of flowers, estimated at over 60 million stems, flooded the gates of Kensington and Buckingham Palace, transforming the royal residences into impromptu public shrines. A nation, and indeed the world, was united in raw, unbridled sorrow. People wept openly in the streets, strangers comforting strangers, all sharing in the shocking loss of a woman they felt they knew. But while the people mourned, the palace stayed chillingly silent. The royal family, on their annual holiday at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, remained behind its thick stone walls. There was no statement, no flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, no public acknowledgement of the nation's pain. Their stoic, stiff upper-lip adherence to protocol was seen not as dignified, but as a shocking, cold-hearted indifference to the death of the mother of the future king. The public mood, already steeped in grief, quickly curdled into immense fury. The headlines screamed, "Show US you care." The monarchy, which had cast Diana out, now seemed utterly and dangerously disconnected from the people it was meant to lead. The Queen's primary concern was for her grandsons, shielding them from the news and the public glare, but this private response was a disastrous public miscalculation. For 5 agonizing days, the silence from Balmoral was deafening. It was a crisis that brought the modern royal family to its lowest point, threatening the very legitimacy of the crown and forcing the Queen into a humiliating public reversal to save her family's reputation. For Prince Charles, the news of Diana's death was a personal and public cataclysm. While the Queen initially hesitated, it was Charles who insisted on taking the royal flight to Paris to bring Diana's body home, a rare moment where he defied his mother's wishes for a more private retrieval. It was a grim, solitary journey into the heart of a tragedy he helped create. And then came the most agonizing task of all. He was the one who had to walk into a room at Balmoral and tell their 2 young sons, William, aged 15, and Harry, just 12, that their mother was gone forever. It was a moment of unimaginable, life-altering pain. In the days that followed, the full, crushing weight of his complicated, toxic history with Diana crashed down upon him. He was besieged by a maelstrom of guilt and profound regret. He had lost the woman who, despite their bitter and public conflicts, was a person of immense, undeniable importance in his life. She was the mother of his children, the woman who had made him a father. He had never been able to fully love her, trapped by duty, emotional inadequacy, and a heart that had always belonged to another. And now she was gone, her life brutally extinguished. In the immediate aftermath, he was reportedly consumed with fears that he would be blamed, even assassinated, by a public that saw him as the villain in her tragic story. But beyond the fear was a genuine, deep-seated sorrow. Her violent death would forever mark him, a permanent, indelible stain on his legacy. He could become king, he could marry Camilla, he could dedicate his life to public service, but he would never escape the ghost of the princess he wronged. It would be his private torment, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. In the immediate, raw aftermath of Diana's death, public grief quickly morphed into a furious search for a villain, and the world found one in Camilla Parker Bowles. Overnight, she became the prime target of a nation's rage, the woman widely seen as the architect of the princess's misery. She was dubbed the most hated woman in Britain, a cruel but accurate reflection of the public mood. The vitriol was so intense that she was forced to retreat completely from public life, becoming a phantom who dared not show her face for fear of being physically attacked. For years, she remained in the shadows, a pariah paying the price for a love affair that had ended in a global tragedy. But behind the scenes, a slow, meticulous, and brilliantly executed public relations campaign was being launched from the prince's camp, dubbed Operation Mrs. PB. It was masterminded by Charles's formidable spin doctor, Mark Bolland. The goal was audacious: to soften Camilla's image, to slowly and carefully reintroduce her to a hostile public, and to ultimately transform her from a royal homewrecker into a suitable and accepted consort for the future king. It began with carefully staged photo ops, charity appearances, and subtle press briefings designed to humanize her. It was a long, patient, and incredibly risky effort. Camilla herself had to endure years of wrath, criticism, and extended solitude in silence. She weathered the storm with a stoicism that even her critics had to acknowledge. She was playing the long game, waiting with unwavering loyalty for the day when the public's anger would finally subside. She was waiting for the day she could finally step out of the shadows and claim the position and the man she had coveted for decades. The campaign to make Camilla queen had begun, a shocking and audacious move in the face of overwhelming public hostility. In 2005, after decades of scandal, heartbreak, and unimaginable tragedy, Prince Charles finally married the woman he had always loved. The wedding to Camilla Parker Bowles was the culmination of a love story that had defied public opinion, royal protocol, and even death itself. But this was not a grand state affair like his first wedding, which had been a global spectacle of fairy tale illusion. This was a modest, almost apologetic, civil ceremony held in the unassuming Windsor Guildhall. The pomp and circumstance were conspicuously absent, a tacit acknowledgement of the painful and controversial path that had led them to this day. In a subtle but powerful signal of the lingering controversy, the Queen herself did not attend the civil ceremony, citing her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which discourages divorce. While she later hosted a reception for the couple, her absence from the main event spoke volumes. The wedding signified the end of a long and painful chapter, a moment of finality for a prince who had spent his life caught between duty and desire. But it was not a universally celebrated fairy tale ending. For many, especially those who still revered the memory of Diana, it was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a stark reminder of the princess's suffering and a final, public confirmation that the woman blamed for the destruction of the royal marriage had, in the end, won. She had gotten her prince. The event was met with muted public enthusiasm, a far cry from the jubilant crowds that had celebrated his first marriage. Charles had finally achieved a measure of peace, the freedom to be with the woman who had always been his anchor. But it came at a terrible price, a price paid in years of misery, public humiliation, and a tragic death that would forever cast a dark shadow over their union. Diana's tragic life and the toxic turmoil of his parents' marriage left a deep, indelible mark on her two sons, forging two profoundly different men from the wreckage of a shared trauma. William, as the heir to the throne, absorbed the harsh lessons of duty and restraint. He learned to compartmentalize, becoming the steadfast protector of the monarchy. He is a man constantly forced to balance his deep love for his mother's legacy with the stark, unyielding demands of his royal destiny. He embodies the continuity of the crown, even at great personal cost, a path his mother could never fully accept. Harry, on the other hand, the spare, seemed to inherit his mother's rebellious heart and her deep, ingrained suspicion of the institution she called the firm. Diana's well-documented difficulties with press intrusion, public criticism, and the suffocating constraints of royal life heavily influenced his own shocking and unprecedented decision to abdicate his senior royal duties. In fleeing the UK with his wife, Meghan Markle, he was, in many ways, attempting to escape the very same machine that he believes hounded his mother to her death. He chose personal freedom over inherited duty, a direct echo of his mother's own desperate yearning. The unresolved trauma of their childhood and the grief of their mother's shocking death drove the once inseparable brothers down two dramatically divergent paths. One embraced the gilded cage of the crown, choosing to preserve the system from within. The other fled from it, choosing to expose its perceived cruelties from the outside. It is a tragic, public schism, a heartbreaking rift born from a shared, unbearable loss that has fractured the very future of the monarchy. The consequences have been disastrous, leaving the royal family more divided and vulnerable than ever before. Perhaps the most explosive part of Diana's legacy is what she left behind in her own hand. Her private journals, letters, and the secret audio tapes she made with Andrew Morton, filled with her raw anguish and brutally unfiltered thoughts, remain a ticking time bomb at the very heart of the monarchy. These annotations are not just historical records, they are a devastating indictment of the royal system. They provide the clearest, most heartbreaking window into the depth of her suffering, her crippling loneliness, her rage at Charles's infidelity, her constant feelings of inadequacy, and the cold indifference she faced from the royal family. She wrote, "He makes me feel like I'm a problem, an inconvenience, something to be managed rather than loved." As William and Harry have grown older and come to understand the full, horrific extent of their mother's misery, these revelations have undoubtedly and profoundly colored their perspective of their father and the woman he eventually married. For William, the future king, his mother's words represent a painful, complicated history to be carefully managed, a private grief he must balance with his public duty to an institution that failed her so spectacularly. But for Harry, they seem to be a call to action. Her words about feeling trapped, about the press intrusion, about a system that offers no protection, have become the very blueprint for his own rebellion. Her private anguish appears to have become his public motivation to protect his own family from suffering the same fate, whatever the cost. Diana's words, written in secret decades ago, continue to haunt the Windsor dynasty, a powerful and poignant testament to the dark truth she was never allowed to speak freely in life, and a legacy of pain that has driven her sons apart. For over 70 years, Charles was the heir apparent, the longest-serving Prince of Wales in British history. He became heir at the age of 3, when his mother ascended the throne. His entire existence was defined by a single, all-consuming task: waiting. But his decades in the royal waiting room were not a peaceful preparation for his ultimate role. They were a form of extended public purgatory. He could never escape the toxic scandals that defined his youth and early adulthood. The ghost of his failed, tragic marriage to Diana and his torrid, lifelong affair with Camilla loomed over his every public act, a permanent stain on his character in the eyes of millions. He threw himself into his work, becoming a passionate and often prescient champion for environmental causes, long before they were fashionable. He dedicated himself to his charities, most notably the Prince's Trust, which has helped over 1 million disadvantaged young people. He attempted to carve out a meaningful role for himself, to prove his worth beyond his scandalous romantic life. But it was a losing battle. To a vast and unforgiving portion of the public, he would always be the villain of the story, the cold, adulterous husband who broke the people's princess's heart. Every milestone, every public appearance, was viewed through the inescapable lens of his past. The public's perception of him was irrevocably colored by his treatment of Diana. He was a king in waiting, forever trapped by the past, a man whose popularity ratings consistently lagged behind those of his mother, his sons, and even his late wife. He was on track to become a monarch whose reign would be defined not by what he did, but by the devastating, deeply personal choices he had made half a century earlier. It was a crushing burden, a lifetime spent waiting for a job that many felt he no longer deserved. And so we return to the beginning of our story. To the 6-year-old king, standing at the twilight of his life, and his shocking, heartfelt confession. After a lifetime of scandal and repressed heartache, he speaks with raw emotion of the love of my life, a soulmate with whom he never had the chance to age. His words hang in the air, a final, heartbreaking riddle that sums up the tragedy of his entire existence. But who was he talking about? Was it a final, public tribute to his wife, Queen Camilla, the woman who endured decades of scorn and public humiliation to be by his side, his constant anchor in a life of turmoil? It seems the most logical, diplomatic answer, or, in a more shocking turn, was it a belated, guilt-ridden acknowledgement of Diana, the beautiful princess whose life was cut brutally short at just 36, a woman he could never love, but whose ghost has haunted his every waking moment? Or was it the biggest bombshell of all? Was this aging king finally allowing himself to mourn the first, true love he was forced to sacrifice to the crown all those years ago, a lament for the anonymous woman who saw him simply as a man, and for the ordinary, happy life he was never allowed to live? The ambiguity is agonizing. His words are the final, heartbreaking puzzle of a man who inherited a kingdom but seems to have lost the one thing he ever truly wanted. It is a confession that solves nothing, but in the end reveals everything about his tragic, unfulfilled, and profoundly lonely heart. In the end, the story of King Charles III is not a tale of triumph, but a devastating cautionary fable about the corrosive nature of duty when it is divorced from love. It is the story of a man born to a destiny he could not escape, a man who waited his entire life for the crown, but perhaps lost his soul in the process. He now sits on the throne his whole, long life prepared him for, but his reign is, and will forever be, haunted by the ghosts of the women he loved and lost. The forbidden love sacrificed for duty, the fairy-tale princess destroyed by the system, and the patient mistress who finally became queen. His life serves as a brutal reminder that behind the pomp, pageantry, and unimaginable privilege, even kings can be prisoners of fate. Their lives can become a tragic tapestry of regret, sacrifice, and fateful choices that can never be undone. The damage he inflicted upon Diana, his sons, and the monarchy itself is a stain that time may soften but will never fully erase. His legacy will forever be intertwined with that of the sainted princess he so publicly wronged. He may be remembered as a king who championed noble causes and served his country with dedication, but for many, that will always be secondary. He will be remembered as the man who had a fairy tale and broke it. A king defined less by his rule and more by the spectacular, heartbreaking wreckage of his own heart. He spent a lifetime waiting for a crown, only to find it lined with the thorns of his own regrets. A king who inherited an empire, but could never rule his own heart. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to Majesty Uncovered for more untold royal stories. Video description, illustration, image prompts. An ultra-photorealistic portrait of a young, sensitive Prince Charles in his Gordonstoun uniform, standing alone in a harsh, windswept Scottish courtyard, his face showing profound sadness and isolation, cold grey stone walls of the school in the background, dramatic overcast lighting casting deep shadows, like 16:9, S750, style RAW, Q2. 2. A cinematic photorealistic scene of a dashing 1970 seconds, Prince Charles sharing a secret, joyful laugh with a beautiful unknown woman in a sun-dappled English garden, their body language intimate and unguarded, golden hour lighting, a feeling of a stolen, fleeting moment of genuine happiness. SR 16:9, S750, style RAW, Q2. 3. A dramatic, ultra-sharp photo of Princess Diana on her wedding day, from a low angle looking up at her in the magnificent street, Paul's Cathedral, the iconic dress and opulent surroundings contrasted with her haunted, deeply sorrowful eyes that are filled with unshed tears, cinematic depth of field, PAR 16, 9S750, style RAW, Q2. 4. The twisted, smoking wreckage of a black Mercedes S280 crumpled against a concrete pillar inside the dark Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, the scene illuminated by the brutal, relentless strobing of paparazzi camera flashes, creating a chaotic and horrific atmosphere, motion blur on the edges, AR 16:9, S750, style RAW, Q2. 5. A hyper-realistic, poignant close-up of a 76-year-old King Charles III wearing the heavy imperial state crown which seems to weigh him down, his face etched with deep lines of sorrow and a lifetime of regret, a single tear visible on his cheek, dramatic chiaroscuro lighting in a dark throne room, La 16, 9, S752, style RAW, Q2, 6. A moody, photorealistic depiction of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles having a clandestine conversation in a misty, English countryside setting, dressed in tweed, their expressions serious and conspiratorial, a sense of secrets being shared away from prying eyes. R16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, 7. A powerful, cinematic image of Princess Diana, now divorced, confidently walking through an Angolan landmine field, wearing protective gear, her face a mask of compassion and determination, starkly contrasting her glamorous past with her dangerous humanitarian work. 116-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, illustration image, prompts 16-9, 1080p, SEO tags, King Charles, Princess Diana, Queen Camilla, Royal Family, Royal Scandal, British Monarchy, Prince Charles Affair, Untold Story, Royal Secrets, King Charles Confession, The Crown, Diana's Death, Royal History, Windsor, Royal Documentary, Prince William, Prince Harry Forbidden Love, SEO tags, English, thumbnail prompts, E. Extreme close-up on the wrinkled, tear-filled eye of King Charles III, with a ghostly, faded reflection of a young, beautiful Princess Diana, visible within his iris, ultra-photorealistic, high-contrast, dramatic lighting, conveys deep regret and haunting memories. AR16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2. 2. A powerful split-screen image. On the left, a regal King Charles III looking somber. On the right, a mysterious, shadowy silhouette of an unknown woman from the 1970 seconds, with a bold question mark between them. High drama, cinematic color grading, AR16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, 3. A hyper-realistic portrait of King Charles, with his hand partially covering his mouth, as if about to reveal a shocking secret, his eyes wide with sorrow and conflict, dramatic side lighting that casts half his face in deep shadow, extremely eye-catching, R16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, 4. A composite image of three women's faces, a smiling Camilla, a sad Diana, and a faceless, shadowy silhouette fading into one another behind a pensive-looking King Charles, symbolizing the three great loves and tragedies of his life. Cinematic and highly intriguing, AR16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, 5. A striking image of a single, withered rose lying on a cracked and broken royal crown, symbolizing a broken fairy tale and lost love, set against a dark, moody background, photorealistic texture on the crown's metal and the rose petals, minimalist yet powerful, AR16-9, S750, style RAW, Q2, thumbnail prompts, 16-9, 1080p, engaging thumbnail concepts, generation summary. Channel name used, Majesty Uncovered. Opening hook, generated 10 to 20 second attention grabber. Total characters, 47812. Chapters generated, 23. Language, English. Knowledge sections applied, 12/12. Cultural elements preserved, yes. Enhanced features, complete package ready.